not in our names. Like, we refuse to allow Jews to be a moral cover for genocide and apartheid and for the US's own financial and imperial interests that drive our support of Israel. We refuse to have Jews be used in that way, and we will do everything we can to not only refuse that, but to actually deliver the material change needed to see a very different world.
All right. Hi and welcome. We're really glad to have you with us.
Welcome, Stefanie. It's lovely to have you with us.
What an honor. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Can you sort of walk us through what it's been like for you as JVP? What is it that JVP does? Who are you? Who are your members' values?
Absolutely. Yes. So I have the honor of being the executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is the world's largest progressive Jewish organization in support of Palestinian rights and freedom, and the largest Jewish anti-Zionist organization in the world. And we have hundreds of thousands of Jews who are working for a vision of freedom, justice, and equality for all people, no exceptions, and for a free Palestine, as part of that. And we work in the US. We have over 100 chapters and local groups all throughout the country. We have a rabbinic council. We have students on, dozens and dozens of campuses. And all of that grassroots power is really devoted to the kind of change that we think will sustain and create that better world, primarily at this point through shifting the role that the U.S. plays in upholding and sustaining Israeli oppression, apartheid, and genocide of Palestinians. And simply making the very simple and clear and important message, like, not in our names. Like, we refuse to allow Jews to be a moral cover for genocide and apartheid and for the US's own financial and imperial interests that drive our support of Israel. We refuse to have Jews be used in that way, and we will do everything we can to not only refuse that, but to actually deliver the material change needed to see a very different world. So it has been a time of, of sort of a amplification of what we've been doing all along, but a much bigger form of it. And we've had, we're probably by every measure 3 times the size organization we were 3 years ago. And I think that reflects the meteoric growth of the Palestinian freedom movement overall. And I think that's the kind of contradiction we're all facing, right? We are seeing more grassroots power in this movement than it's ever been, mobilizing with more force and more sophistication than has ever happened before. And yet we're, of course, horrifyingly aware that we have not stopped the genocide, even, a ceasefire in name only, and that it is the moment for us to continue to escalate and grow our work so that, all of that power actually ends this sort of U.S.-Israel genocidal war machine that continues unabated in spite of all of that
Stephanie,
growth.
you began by saying you're the world's largest anti-Zionist Jewish community-based organization. And that word has now begun to be thrown around with such alarming misconceptions. And I think it would be great for our listeners and for us really to understand how you understand Zionism and why, as a Jewish peace group, you think this is so important for us to be able to have a clear understanding. Because I think many communities, both in the European context, in the UK, where Sanam is based right now, and here in New York City, where I live, are being told that to be anti-Zionist is tantamount to being anti-Semitic.
Absolutely. Zionism is what it does, right? And it's the political ideology that led to the expulsion of more than 750,000 Palestinians from their land and homes in order to create a discriminatory ethno-state with exclusive rights for Jews over those indigenous Palestinians on their own land. That is what Zionism always was and has continued to be in the carrying out of the unchanged policies of the Israeli government, which we now see in their most grotesque and mask-off form through the continued genocide. But it is this ideology, and as a Jewish group, why then be anti-Zionist? Of course, all folks, anybody who cares about ending systems that create such catastrophic harm should be anti-Zionist. But for Jews, there's a very personal stake, because Zionism suggests that Jews require that supremacist nation state to answer the very real question, historically and today, of Jewish safety. And as a Jewish organization, we believe that everywhere in the world, Jews belong and should be safe. And of course, though, that real safety will never grow from guns and checkpoints and walls and a police state, and that true safety will be built through forging real solidarity and fighting for a world where all are living in dignity and safety and freedom. And so anti-Zionism is the obvious choice for anybody and for all of us who support liberation and justice for the Palestinian people, including their right to return to their homes and land, and a future for all people on that land and all land, where freedom and safety and equality are the baseline.
It's amazing how over certainly in the last few years, but the last 20 years of having lived in America, self-censorship becomes so embedded in our in our own mind and in our own hearts. So this conversation, on the one hand, I'm like, oh my God, we're actually having the conversation. But at the one of the questions I have, of course, is that the minute this issue of anti-Semitism and Zionism comes up, the question of Israel as a state, and I'm curious about what you think, but my explanation when I talk to people is that, we criticize the Iranian regime. That doesn't mean I'm criticizing the entity of Iran, or certainly not Islam or whatever other cultural things. That mean there's a
or the Iranian people,
or the Iranian. It's we don't like we may not like the Trump MAGA thing, but doesn't mean you're against the United States or the people. So, do you see that same kind of analogy in terms of Judaism, Israel, Zionism, or what happens to the state of Israel in the vision that you have of and the podcast is If We Were in Charge. So if we were in charge, what would be your vision of what happens to Israel and that region and the kind of state, the people, the rights and so forth, and security that both sides obviously need?
Yeah, it's interesting, though. The conversation often turns to the question of the right of states, which is where are we in the world today that we are talking about the right that rogue genocidal ethno-states have in some sort of intrinsic rights, rather than the rights of human beings literally being surviving, if they can, a live stream genocide for more than 2 years. It's the red herring of it all is so obvious on its face, but we get trapped in these cycles of conversation, And it's like the simple idea that we want a society rooted in both just the basics of international law and human rights norms, which have been so massively eroded in the last 3 years, let alone many decades, but that we're living in the consequences of having decimated those norms, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What was possible in a society there then rooted in equality and for all under the law. And so I think that it's we get brought into these conversations that really take us away from the very simple, very obvious realities of what is so wrong with the world today, with the state of Israel as it functions and as it always has functioned.
And Stefanie, following up on what Sanam said, of course, I've just been through as I had mentioned to you, the election of Zoran Mamdani in New York City, which is often referred to as the second largest Jewish city outside of Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting to see how strongly Israel as a state has responded to, the politics of a city miles away, and how threatened in a way. I mean, Netanyahu just came out and personally responded to Mamdani's first actions, revoking the executive orders which had to do with Israel. Can you talk a little bit about Mamdani's campaign, why JVP was so supportive, and what you think his win means for the progressive movement and movements, really, both in the United States and beyond? Because both Sanam and I have been struck by how much it has been an inspiration for people much outside of the US. We just talked to someone in Italy earlier today, and she was saying how one of the things that gave her hope was Mamdani's win. So tell us about your JVP's perspective on this.
Well, JVP Action, our sister 501c4 organization, was a day one endorser of Mamdani's run for mayor. We've worked with him for years, for instance, introducing legislation in the state assembly to end tax breaks for settler organizations in the state of New York. And so, he'd been with us in protest in the streets for years and years. And so we understood that he had a politics of moral consistency and a vision for the city of real, not just survival, which it's very hard to survive in the one of the most expensive cities in the world, but also of thriving, which is very much our politics, and so to see a politician embody those things so fully and to know he was trustworthy in his consistency made it clear to us that this was a run that really mattered and that could be quite transformative.
And Stefanie, so two things. One is when you say JVP mobilizes and so forth, you just gave an example of advocacy in terms of policy. What is it that you do? I mean, if somebody says, hey, I want to join you, what is it that you guys wake up and do on a daily basis, or in your chapters or your members?
So our chapters and members across the country work at sort of transforming things politically, financially, and culturally. So we really understand that from the U.S., that U.S.-Israel alliance upholding Israeli apartheid is held in place by those different sort of pillars of support. And so our members and chapters are doing the day-to-day work of shifting and transforming the way that functions. So for instance, boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns allow for everyday people to withdraw the complicity of their institutions, their cities, their states in those oppressive systems upholding Israeli apartheid, or in the corporations that are war profiteers off of the genocide, right? And so we see so for instance, our chapters in almost 20 cities and states across the country right now are working in coalition to end Israel bonds sales in cities and states where they live. So Israel bonds are unrestricted loans that go directly into the Israeli treasury and fund settlement expansion, the genocide, everything.
So my finance knowledge is absolutely rubbish, but when you
Tell
say
us what a bond is.
Yeah,
What is
exactly.
a bond? Yeah.
And presumably bonds give interest rates to people.
Well,
How does
yes,
that work?
bonds are basically an unrestricted loan to the Israeli government where the money goes directly from our pension funds, our city budgets, our state budgets, in the hundreds or tens of millions of dollars, money directly from our communities into the Israeli treasury, completely unrestricted, to commission these war crimes. And that money is invested as a loan from the U.S. side to the Israeli government. And it's
supposed to be paid back.
Right, that's the notion. But then these bonds are sold again and again, right? So, over a quarter of Israeli external debt, so for the Israeli economy, is held in these U.S. Israeli bonds. So over a quarter of that debt that Israel holds, it turns out that carrying out a genocide and constantly escalating wars of aggression throughout the region is very costly for the state of Israel. And it's underwritten by American taxpayers, obviously with the billions of dollars sent by our federal government, but it's also underwritten by other billions of dollars sent from our cities, states, and institutions.
By the rest of us.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And so everyday people are doing a beautiful job of saying, absolutely not. Do not invest our money in this. And it turns out also that it tends to be a bad investment, honestly.
I was going to say.
Yeah, it's a bad investment. So it also betrays the fiduciary responsibility that these treasurers and others are holding in making these choices.
So, Stefanie, that's why we see, for example, I've seen city council meetings where young members of any age, actually, you're right, it's very intergenerational, members of JVP are attending a city council meeting and then they stand up and they say, we don't support this proposed city council decision or resolution because we feel it's a poor use of our tax dollars. And
That's right.
those are local tax dollars in that case.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, like in the city of New York, as we're talking about, the former comptroller of New York agreed Brad Lander, who was in office before this term,
Yay, Brad.
agreed to divest from Israel bonds in the city accounts, right? Or to sell off those bonds. And Mark Levine is the new comptroller, and there is a very active campaign to insist that that become ongoing policy, right? So it's a decision made at that local level. They're also in state pension funds.
And is there any other country other than Israel? Like, could there be an Iran bond or an India bond or is it only Israel?
I'm sure there's an Iran bond. I'm like a North Korea
Pointing
bond.
out, I'm just pointing out how rare it is for
Yeah.
there's not a France bond either or a UK
Right.
bond.
There are a few other sovereign bonds, but far and away the Israel bonds are, because they're used as a historically have been used as a political statement. And the state of Israel is very direct in saying it's a way of BDS proofing the economy, meaning that for other campaigns, which people are also involved in, of saying, like, for instance, corporations that are also making money hand over fist because of the genocide and should not be invested in war profiteers, full stop, period, anywhere in the world, including in Israel, or in companies that like make their money off of occupation, surveillance, etc. And so in BDS campaigns, pulling money out of those corporations or pushing those corporations to pull out of Israel, that has an impact on the Israeli economy. And these Israel bonds basically underwrite that, ensure that the economy can continue to forward this unending war. It's a war economy that needs constantly fueled and funded. And so I think that it's like historically, our mayors and governors have been able to just be like, we're proudly sending $200 million to support Israel, like basically doing it as like a contribution to the genocidal war effort. But because there's been such a sea change in what the common sense is across American cities and towns and states, there is an opportunity to translate that understanding of what's right into the policy of where our money is going as taxpayers. And so more and more people are doing that, not just raising our voices in sort of broad protest, but really making it targeted so that we can withdraw our complicity. Like, it's not even at this point an act of solidarity. It's an act of saying, I don't want to be literally complicit with my money in these.
If you read the statutes of the Nuremberg tribunals, right, it says people can be brought forward to the court if one of the things is if you aid and abet war crimes and genocide. And aid and abet is a very broad term.
Yes.
But I think about it in terms of, well, if my taxes are going towards weapons and support, then I am being de facto forced into aiding and abetting and becoming a war criminal. Can we not collectively join up and say, I don't want to pay my taxes because I don't want to be a war criminal? Like, is there some kind of movement around that kind of issue? Because obviously in the States or in the UK, if you don't pay your taxes, they come after you. But if the state is doing something that counters, it is literally making me a criminal.
I mean, in a way, you're asking about civil disobedience, Sanam.
Mm-hmm. It is, but it needs to, I'm just thinking from a legal standpoint, or from whether there is a movement that we can all sign up to and make it a collective thing, because my taxes are a pittance. Obviously, they'll say it's gone for other things, but collectively, are these the types of ideas or campaigns that you guys start to think about around how else to expand what could be done and how ordinary people can get involved?
Well, the point you're making of like being forced to be complicit in genocide and ongoing apartheid is, it's what in many ways gets me up every morning to say, like, I refuse. When I say, like, this is a huge movement of Jews just simply saying I refuse, it's a huge movement of all people, right? Saying I refuse to be complicit in this. It's obscene. And I think that there's lots of ways to translate that into collective action that can actually end that complicity, right? And so your suggestion of like tax resisting is, The anti-war movement has a proud history of that as a tactic. At this point, there's a few things that, like, the call for international solidarity in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions from Palestinian civil society, which originated in 2005, is, in so many ways our best bet of translating that feeling you're talking about, Sanam, of like, how dare those in power put me and my own money even into complicity with the crimes against humanity. The choice of boycott and divestment allows for us to turn that individual feeling into a form of collective action that could actually shift the bottom line for those war profiteering corporations, pull the money of those investments out of where they currently are supporting Israel, and many other such choices, right? So there is also the fact that, like, we should never understand the way that US policy, or UK policy for that matter, is sort of immutable. That, like, okay, this is where our tax dollars go and that's where it will always go. They would like us to think that. They would like us to feel
they'd like us not to even know, right? Like they'd rather
to not even know, to like
pay up and shut up. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that there's this, we really see an obligation, right? From living inside of the United States, right here in sort of the belly of the beast, quite honestly, what is our responsibility, not just to like be like, it's a bummer that billions of dollars of ours are going to to a genocide right this second as we walk and breathe, but actually to say we can organize in all of these ways and insist upon a change in that. We actually have an obligation to do so.
Stefanie, can I ask you something personal? How, when you're leading movements like this, and on the one hand, we are saying that it is intergenerational, and yet, even in our own family, as I told you, I have a family of extended Jewish relatives, we can definitely see a difference amongst people who feel just very strongly that being aligned with the State of Israel is part of their core identity. And you said earlier that you work on the cultural level, on the policy level, and what was the third one?
And the financial, like we're talking about.
And the financial level, right,
Yeah.
what we're talking about. So tell us a little bit about the cultural shifts and changes, because honestly, as Sanam said, we both came to this country at a time when you couldn't even discuss this in open. Yes, Edward Said had written Orientalism, and yes, Edward and Iqbal Ahmed and Ibrahim Abu Lughad were like, talking about Palestinian rights, but I mean, Iqbal couldn't even get a job anywhere except at Hampshire College. And that was thanks to Cora Weiss,
Yeah.
So, bless her soul, may her life be a memory to us. But I'm just curious, how do you do this at a personal, cultural level in which you're shifting perceptions that have been long held and that are almost sacrosanct? As Sanam said, you couldn't even raise this issue, much less have an open discussion like this. And what are your strategies that you feel have worked?
Great question. Well, I think on a few different levels we work culturally, right? The fact is that what you're describing of sort of this period of time in which Jewish identity, the State of Israel worked very hard to fuse Jewish identity with Zionism, with unconditional support for its policies.
Right.
It's very important when you're doing culture shift work to like have the longer arc of history and memory at hand. As long as there has been Zionism, which it's a 19th century movement that, drew its vision and ideology from other colonial movement and nation state ideology at the time. You're just bread and butter. It's not unique. It's not exceptional. But, as long as there has been a Zionist movement, there have been anti-Zionist Jews.
That's true.
And in fact, it's only since really 1967 that a sort of consolidation of American Jewish identity around a Zionist politics was even common or the norm. So I think it's like really, it's in living memory that this became the supposed always core Jewish identity. It's very, very short. In the millennia of Jewish history, it's the tiniest blip, quite honestly. And so,
that's a great way to remind us of just the time frame on that.
Because we're in this urgency all the time, and the compression of the sort of culture of silencing and and that you're talking about can make it feel the walls close in and you feel very focused on those four walls around you. But you have to, in doing this work, see the longer arc and understand and really draw strength from, those sort of movement ancestors and even elders in the community still today who say, no, like Shatsi, we had this one, we called her the people's babia, like this amazing elder that may her memory continue to be for a blessing, who passed away a couple of years ago. Shatsi Weisberger would say, I'm older than the state of Israel. Like, I can tell you for a fact that this is not core to Jewish identity. But I will say, to your real question though, because for many people, in spite of that history, memory can be short. And there are an enormous set of very, very intentional ways that Zionist culture building inside of American Jewish life over the last half a century has fused those identities and made it feel to Jewish Americans like the answer to questions of Jewish safety and Judaism itself required this ethno-state. And I think what we do is a kind of manyfold, but on one hand, we have, rabbis and spiritual leaders in independent Havarot and synagogues, etc., all over the country who are building a Judaism beyond Zionism, who are really reclaiming and extending those histories that I'm talking about in ways because as a Jewish people, we need to, there's a desperation to honestly secure and save our beautiful tradition from its being weaponized and brutalized and desiccated in this way. And so there's religious work in that way. There's like the liturgical work and community work, making sure we have holiday space that allows for this and communal space to come together. There's also work that is about like unlearning and letting go of the kind of racist conditioning that many of us were raised with. And so we have things like a storytelling project called Wrestling with Zionism, where people come together and just honestly work through their own histories of understanding how and why they were raised to dehumanize Palestinians and to, see a very broken promise of safety in the state of Israel. And to do the internal work of letting go of that. So it operates on a lot of different levels.
Yeah. Stefanie, I'm sitting here listening and I find it in so many ways it's so personal because I grew up in Iran and we had and there is still a very vibrant Jewish community. There's still synagogues and so forth. And even with the Islamist revolution that we all had to endure, they didn't go targeting. Actually, they didn't target the Jewish community. They did not target the Christian community. They targeted people that they were against politically. So, we were Shias and they targeted my family. And then the group that they targeted as a religious minority were the Baha'is because they come after Shiism. So there was kind of from in their theocracy, they don't accept Baha'is. But the Jewish population has lived there and they feel very Iranian. And it was only during the Iran-Iraq war when everyone was trying to get their sons out of Iran because they didn't want their boys being carted off to war that we saw a sort of a shift of migration of Iranian Jews going into Israel. And I remember meeting some in Tel Aviv in the late 90s, and they still felt, at the time, they still felt very Iranian.
Yes.
And to me, it's, in my universe and in the Iranian cultural history, we didn't understand anti-Semitism. And it's not an issue for us. It's not our issue. And yet, when I moved to the United States, anything that I said, anytime I said, the state of Israel is doing whatever, 2003, the curfews that were happening again in the West Bank, everybody just assumed that I was anti-Semitic. And it was as if I'm being, it's like I'd have an allergic reaction to it because I'm like, this isn't my issue, but it's being pushed on us. And now 30 years later, that's become normalized as if you're a Muslim or if you're Middle Eastern or then you are anti-Semitic. And we're like, but this isn't our history. So how does do you have those conversations in the context and spaces that you're having around what is anti-Semitism? What is the source of it? Where did it actually come from? And, and how we've ended up vilifying a whole other part of the world that historically accepted and lived with Jews. So I'm just curious about kind of where did that that narrative fit in, or what the challenges are that you deal with?
Absolutely. I mean, part of what you're talking about is also like the just reality of diasporic Jewish identities all throughout the world. And when we say, you know, what is an anti-Zionist Jewish politic, it's a diasporic one that really claims and honors our many, many varied Jewish histories. There's not one Jewish history. There's, you know, Jews belong
I
everywhere
mean,
in the world.
all the old synagogues in India are testimony to that.
Yes. Yes, and we have incredible leaders in JVP in our Black and Indigenous and Jews of color Sephardi Mizrahi network that do the work of both, you know, having cultural space together to celebrate and extend, you know, those, make sure that there's space that's specific to different of our traditions, and also to do some of the important intellectual thought leadership that you're talking about, Sanam, of making sure that we talk about like the way that both those histories and the sort of like way that Zionism works to flatten all of Jewish history, and also insist on, you know, like, you know, for Jews of the Arab world to be able to return to their homes out that have been actually forced expulsion because of the impacts of the Zionist movement, right? And to ensure that those paths home for Jewish people are not through the state of Israel and through the oppression of Palestinians denying other people access to their ancestral homeland.
Because
you know?
actually, you know, the kind of, if you take it full circle, anti-Semitism and Zionism, there have always been kind of cousins of each other, right? That you could argue that, oh, if you're going to have an exclusionary, you know, Jewish state, then all countries can say, okay, all the Jews should go to Israel. I mean, that's the danger, right? That
right.
It creates
Exactly.
this kind of extremist weaponizing identity.
In fact, the only person in the Balfour Declaration who opposed it amongst British politicians was the only
Yes.
Jewish British
That's
politician,
right.
Montagu, who said exactly what you just said, Sanam. He said, I refuse to accept this Balfour Declaration because it's basically a cover for anti-Semitism in the UK.
Right. Well, you know, Zionism, as you're saying, Zionism and modern anti-Semitism emerge both from this world of Western nation state building concepts that really defined the, you know, other as the most essential way of building a nation state is to have the other that you oppress and push out and, you know, and dominate. And so I think that the reclamation necessary inside of Jewish community of our histories and our futures is important here, you know? And so that beautiful multiplicity of Jewish life and where we like belong and have community is very much a threat to the Zionist and Israeli narrative of, you know, it has to be flattened into this, like, Jews were always oppressed. Somehow Palestinians become the proxy for the crimes of the West and for literal Nazis. And that's projected in order to carry out ongoing, you know, dispossession, ethnic cleansing, just, you know, genocide.
Okay, so a couple of things. Number one, you are in direct opposition. I mean, at least my understanding is that from what you're saying, you would be in direct opposition to groups like AIPAC.
Yes. Safe to
and
say.
Others, and AIPAC Light, which we're now seeing in the UK and elsewhere. I mean, the way in which these movements have spread. What are the kinds of threats? I mean, do you get scared? Do you get threatened? Do you worry about your own safety and security? And yeah, just tell us what that side of life is like to be a peace activist in this universe.
You know, there are a lot of threats against foremost Palestinians and Palestinian organizing, and then anybody who is willing to stand alongside Palestinians fighting for freedom. And that's always been true. It's a very violently repressed movement all throughout the world, foremost inside Israel, but also here in the United States, always has been. And, you know, with the current fascist dissent of our own U.S. government as well, like, you know, Project 2025, authored by the Heritage Foundation, there's an addendum called Project Esther, which is a manual for how to take apart the Palestine movement in order to kind of sharpen the tools for use on everybody.
They're very active in university campuses, right?
Yes, very active, very active.
Be interested to ask you how how they operate also, because we know many people close to us who have been affected by it. So I'm curious to
I'm
explain
sure you do. Yes, yes. And they, so in this Project Esther document of theirs, it is, this addendum, JVP is listed as one of like 3 or 4 organizations. And so we know we're on the target list. But I will say I draw a lot of strength from, like it's a fraction of the kind of targeting that Palestinian partners and leaders that I just like admire with my whole heart. I, have endured for generations really, and are facing right now. And so I just really take a lot of heart from that. And the truth is that I think that, if the cost of my own facing myself and my own soul, it just feels like what is work required of any of us today, and with the complicity we were talking about, with the world that we believe we all deserve. I think that a lot of people right now, the stakes of fighting for a better world are to experience some form of repression or targeting. That's gonna, just yesterday or 2 days ago, this woman shot by ICE in Minnesota, and I think that the risks of standing up for what is right, I think are there. But honestly, the cost of not is truly, I believe, are really like our own humanity. So there's kind of no question there for me. And that I don't particularly feel, I think I would feel so much worse and more vulnerable if I were to accept the world as it is.
I mean, I think the one thing I would add, Sanam, is in my conversation, certainly, Stefanie, as a board member of Visualizing Palestine with you, I think it's fair to say that this administration has seen it fit to be able to use mechanisms that are not obvious mechanisms of direct violent oppression, but for example, asking for an audit or reviewing your files or refusing you a renewal of your 501, your charitable status, or trying to ask kind of devious questions about the other arm of a JVP, which is their, the arm that does political organizing and advocacy work. I think certainly it would be fair to say that there are many ways in which you as an organization and then individual members of your organization have been put under scrutiny, are the recipients of vile language and threats online. I've seen a lot of online bullying. The notion that you're a self-hating Jew, always the perfect, lovely example that is thrown at any Jewish person who dares to challenge the current status quo.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think it's entirely fair, although you are being very modest. I think it's not entirely fair to say that you have not faced significant challenges. And of course, all of the people who have courted arrest over these last 2 years, at the very least, are still dealing with issues of their legal protection, their rights, etc. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. I mean, it's true. And I think people should know it's true that being in this movement isn't without risk. Like we have like 5 active lawsuits against us right now, which these Trump-aligned law firms just throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying to slow down our work. And, there are constant threats. It is scary. I mean, to be honest, it is scary to have, the White House say we're on a list with 8 organizations, these for criminalization. But I think that what I was trying to get at, it's not to be falsely humble. It's to say that, like, we live in it's a terrifying political conditions that have been allowed to be set as somehow normal that we live in. And so when I feel some of that fear about what is the part of it that's facing JVP or me individually or my family, whatever, I do think it's that long view again. It's to say, I feel fear. Okay, that's part of my experience right now. And I feel enormous gratitude to get to be in this life doing this work. And to be doing anything else would be much more scary. To be accepting these violent conditions and thinking there was no better life would be terrifying at a really different level.
And Stefanie, I mean, implicit in what you're saying is that you are you're conscious of the privilege that you have compared to your Palestinian counterparts, right?
Absolutely. Of
And
course.
sometimes people look at these issues and they say, in the United States, the discourse is always kind of handled by Jews that are pro-Palestine or Jewish people that are whatever Zionists, but the Palestinian voice is muted there. From where you sit, how you navigate that in terms of both, again, sharing that privilege that you have and using your privilege and what comes with it, but at the same time having the spaces or being able to give some of that protection or resources or whatever it is to the Palestinian organizations and the Palestinian activists themselves who, do they come into your spaces and into your synagogues to talk to people? Like, how do you share the privilege, if you want?
Absolutely. I mean, our accountability to our Palestinian partners is like sacrosanct to us because it's everything. We have these core values that are like accountability to Palestinians, to our Palestinian partners, responsibility to and for our own Jewish communities, and commitment to collective liberation and racial justice more broadly. And we see that as like a braid, that everything we do has to be woven with those commitments, When it comes to accountability to our Palestinian partners, I mean, Palestinians will liberate themselves, are leading their own liberation movement. And as we've been talking about this whole time, our work as Jews or anybody else in the movement is to honestly end the complicity that allows for the unjust status quo and upholds it, So it's really it's our own obligation. It's not a favor. It's our own obligation and our own work. But then also the work is in deep, deep partnership and collaboration always, which is so beautiful and life-giving and fun. You know what I mean? Because like we're just a beautiful community of people fighting for justice together. And so the Palestinian-led organizations here in the US that are sort of form the core, the heart, and the front of the movement are essential. And we work with day in and day out. And like, whether that's at the community level, sometimes it's our job to educate our own people and be the ones to, like as I was saying, undo and unlearn. But when it comes to, like, I talk about our Israel bonds campaigns or divestment campaigns, etc., that's very often and almost always in coalition, which will include Palestinian-led formations locally or our partners at the national level, like U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights or Adult Justice Project or Institute for Middle East Understanding or AROC in the Bay, or, the list goes on, Palestine Legal, Visualizing Palestine. There's just an amazing array of movement organizations that have Palestinian leadership or are entirely Palestinian youth movement that are, that I think we are always acutely aware of the way that we're in it together, and also the way that because of the intensity and pervasiveness of anti-Palestinian racism structurally in the US, those individuals and organizations will face a kind of repression that will always be, be different, and that we have to show up and flank at all times.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a bunch of questions that we always ask our guests. Do you want to go, Kavita, with the first one?
Sure. So you've kind of already alluded to this, but we're going to ask you anyway. What's a radical idea or an allegedly radical idea that you think should be normal or that you don't think is radical at all? If you were going to pick one.
If I'm going to pick one, I mean, I guess that every human life is equally valuable, full stop.
Well, isn't that
crazy?
Really shouldn't be a radical idea, really not present in our politics.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's the Miss Rachel story, right? Sanam, Miss Rachel is this wonderful, you know who she is. She's the influencer and the young, woman who's been supporting kids. And yeah, exactly. Radical idea. Okay, Sanam, you go next.
Question number 2. If you were in charge right now and had to, as I say, in charge of determining U.S. policy positionality vis-a-vis Israel, Palestine at this moment, like going forward, what are the 3 things that you would do and insist upon?
Well, I would put people thriving, living in dignity with freedom and equality in the center of the policy making. And everything would then flow very easily from that. That would mean full divestment and end of U.S. funding of Israel. It would mean divestment from the systems of harm driven by corporate profit in our politics, war and militarism, prisons, deportations, And then it would mean investing in the life-sustaining programs and vision that we all need to thrive from the, all around the world and here at home.
Pretty clear.
So on the question of divestment from Israel and militarily and so forth, what do you think that would do in terms of catalyzing coexistence or whatever the future is that has to happen? Like, if the US isn't party to that conflict, what will it look like tomorrow?
Yeah, we always say that like the US likes to pose it's quite a costume to imagine they can pose as this anymore, but likes to pose as sort of an honest broker, quote unquote, right? When in fact it's a full partner in Israel's crime. And so if the US were not by billions of dollars funding, fueling, diplomatically defending at all costs Israel's crimes against humanity and ongoing apartheid and genocide, well, then the possibility of actual diplomatic negotiations that the people on the ground living there actually ultimately have to decide their futures rooted in which we carry forward the values of like international law that must be fulfilled, then I think that's actually possible. But it's literally not possible while the oppression is being driven and underwritten and armed by the US government. So it's withdrawing that role.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip the question about the money because I think you've explained to us very well what would happen if we did some of these things. But
the money question, just for you to know, is if you had $1 billion, or if you were a billionaire, what would you do? So you're welcome to answer it.
You're welcome to answer it, but I just also wanted to give you space to answer the what gives you hope. So you can choose, or you can do both.
Okay, I can choose. I mean, if I was a billionaire, I would say there should be no billionaires. I would say, let me give my money back to the people and places I extracted it from, because I would have done so to get that $1 billion. What gives me hope, I think, is, it's organizing. I am consistently moved by, we've talked about Zohran Mamdani's win. We've talked about divestment campaigns across the country. We've talked about, people doing the work to change the hearts and minds of their own communities. And in all of that, it's people saying, these systems of domination and oppression are not inevitable. And if we come together, we can build something really different, and we can root that vision in hope and an idea that we could all thrive next to one another. And actually, it happens. If you get enough people together and you believe enough in what you're building together, like enormously impossible feeling things are simply made possible. And so I'm so grateful to get to be in a movement of people who like sort of can feel despairing, but refuse those politics of despair through organizing.
Well, and I do want to say that I think just statistically, Stefanie, you have had a lot of wins. I think sometimes when we do this, we say, well, what gives you hope? And you think that it's kind of some abstract thing, but you could like list off what you folks have done. And I'm just wondering if you want to say a couple before you end, because I think it's important for people to leave with a sense of the tangibility of hope.
Yeah.
What are you going to add, Sanam?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that, it's, as I said, for me, JVP has been such a standard bearer for and an entity that gives the rest of us courage and cover, frankly, because it's very easy to get smeared with anti-Semitism if you're not Jewish and you criticize Israel. But I also see the movements here in Europe. And I was going to ask you, to what extent has JVP expanded its reach, or are there some sort of coalition building and so forth? Because, we've been involved with a group in Spain and in Italy and here in the UK, that there's huge levels of work. In Germany, a couple of years ago, they closed down Jewish Voices. I think it was a chapter or something.
JVP,
it was a different JVP,
yes.
and they've frozen their bank account.
Yes.
And I kind of look at Germany and think, what are you doing? But I'm curious about what you think about these movement, and are you connected with these other entities around the world as well? And do you take some pride in the fact that maybe you've also inspired some of that work that's going on?
Well, internationally, we really it's a loop of the way organizing works, it's all in relationship, and so it's a loop of hope we give each other, so to see organizing in some ways at smaller stages, earlier stages of like coming together and being embattled in different countries' contexts of like really having a hard time gaining ground, but trying nonetheless, is so inspiring to me, even if it's a much smaller group that has started in these different places. And so being in relationship with those sort of emerging anti-Zionist Jewish organizations all over the world is really so beautiful to us. And we, I think do hope to continue to grow those relationships. We have many and are excited to build more because we're an internationalist organization. It's easy in the U.S. to pretend the U.S. really wants to be the center of the world and pretend no one else exists. And also it's very, as an organization, it's actually core to our values that we see organizing all over the world and understand its relationship to us and ours. And so, yes. In short answer, we're very happy to already have a lot of those connections and are committed to growing them and being of support where we can to say, here's how we did it here in our context in the U.S., what might work to grow anti-Zionist Jewish organizing in your own context, in your own countries. And to the question of, grounded sort of material reasons for hope, I would say, we talked a lot about Israel bonds, and just in the last month, campaigns in 4 different cities and states have run, thank you, have divested almost $30 million from those bonds in just the last month. There's and it's very hard to get the newspapers to report it, but it's really happening city by city, state by state, locally. Those things are underway. And also, the election of Mamdani shows us what can happen in the electoral arena when our movements translate their power into those kinds of wins for governing power as well. So we have many reasons to hope in spite of the very, very horrific news that comes in daily.
And you mentioned the media. How do you navigate, and what would you do if you were in charge at the BBC or, CBS these days, or any of the... In terms of the reporting, because it seems as if the way they've reported has undermined their own credibility so much.
Fully.
So what would you say to people in the media around how to do genuinely objective reporting, or this kind of news, or what's going on in Gaza? I mean, what would be your policy if you were in charge there?
I would have a lot to say. I do have a lot to say. But I mean, to start, we've been talking. You mentioned earlier, Sanam, the literal legal structure that says if you're that dictates like who couldn't be held accountable for manufacturing consent for genocide. And I think that the mainstream media in the US has a grave responsibility in manufacturing consent and allowing for what everybody with their bare eyes could tell was happening from the very beginning. Everything from, right now we're working with a coalition to demand the New York Times retract this completely debunked propaganda piece called Screams Without Wars that came out in December of 2023 that really set the foundation, was cited in U.S. congressional testimony and
by President Biden.
Used as sort of
could you just explain, just because people may not remember what that
is? So this particular piece is sort of makes the case and the claim and says that it's presenting evidence to establish the idea that there was a coordinated, focused, intentional campaign of mass sexual violence perpetrated against Israeli women on October 7th. And that evidence simply was not presented and does not exist in that article. And it's been debunked by other, by other reporting, by sources named in it, by the families of of those who were killed on the day and are alleged as victims in the article, by 60 journalism professors. It's just it's purely a propaganda piece. The writers, the co-authors of it are one of who tweets saying that Gaza should be a slaughterhouse and all should be killed, and was not even a journalist prior to working on this piece, and her nephew, a food blogger, were the two of the main 3 co-authors. Just very obviously been fully debunked in all ways. And the Times, the supposed paper of
Refuses.
record,
Yeah.
refuses to retract it. And it continues to set a precedent for the way that a supposed reporting and journalism can justify then the most, some of the most horrific crimes against humanity that have in our lifetimes, And as a Jewish person whose family, has endured anti-Semitic persecution through the centuries, it's very familiar to see the way propaganda is used to justify and set the scene for genocide, frankly. And so I think that, it is not an understatement to talk about the role of mainstream reporting and corporate media in actually a set of responsibilities for this ongoing genocide. And then contrasted with that, and they've precisely because of that, you see the way that the Israeli government and military has targeted the unbelievably brave Palestinian journalists on the ground who are, more of whom have been assassinated than in any war in, I think maybe ever, certainly in the last 50 years, who have been targeted specifically.
And their families, like literally in their homes,
and their families because of their telling of the truth. And their,
the irony of having Western journalists play into the propaganda or the silencing of the genocide when their own colleagues, themselves, you're looking in the mirror and it's your own colleagues who are paying the price others are paying the price as well, but you have affinity with your own professional
that you would think
community, you would think.
So I think that, it's also another thing that people who are outraged and feeling this, how dare they use passive voice? It'll be like, Gaza Health Ministry alleges child killed by bullet. It's like the way that they will actually twist language to refuse to name the actors and the system of what's actually happening.
And I think in a way, having had Gaza and Ukraine play out simultaneously, side by side, was also so painful to watch because, 3 children would die in the Ukraine and you would hear, Russia targeted, strike, massacres 3 children. And then you would hear, Gaza Health Ministry claims 200 children died, 15,000 children died, and it was just that was really hard.
Just the inherent, it's the weight of that sort of incredibly racist dehumanization of Palestinians that is just like taken as a ground floor for the way the discourse, is so. But I feel that everyday people can actually, it's also, we can hold our media makers and corporate media accountable by, we have right now this, as I mentioned, this campaign to push the New York Times to retract this article. There are lots of chances to, whether it's writing letters to the editor or it's
and those
calling
kinds
out
of things, like if there's a campaign, the public picture makes a difference. And, okay, so we put you in charge of policy, we put you in charge of media.
But I just want to say a huge thanks, Stefanie. We've been so lucky to have you with us, and you have left us with some very. That's what I love, is when people say, well, hope is this kind of like ephemeral thing. And I'm like, no, hope is really tangible. And you just gave us.
Hope is great, but it's the strategy that really matters.
Yeah.
So that you guys have hope and strategy, and you have fabulous people. And it's really a joy to talk to you. Thank you, Stefanie, for joining us.
Such a joy.
I hope to see you in person. Yeah,
I would love to. I'll come back anytime. This was really a treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We may need
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. We will need to hang on.